The car is hers now. You can call a cab.
Easy. I've got you. You're safe now.
She heard him come downstairs before she saw him. Claire was standing at the kitchen window with her decaf going cold in her hands, watching the Upper East Side wake up one light at a time, and she heard Daniel's footsteps on the stairs. That particular rhythm she had learned, the way you learn anything you live with long enough, automatically, without meaning to. Even now, 7 months pregnant, even after the months of careful distance and the phone left face down on the counter. And the way he had stopped asking how she was sleeping, she still knew the sound of him before she saw him. He came in already dressed. Dark suit, hair still damp, the expression of a man whose mind was already somewhere else. He poured coffee, checked his phone, set it face down the way he always did now. Rosa came in through the side door at 7:15, unwinding her scarf, saying good morning to the room, the way she always did, moving around them both with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned not to take up space. Daniel set his cup down. He looked at Claire the way you look at someone when you have decided something and you want credit for saying it yourself before they find out another way. "I need to tell you something," he said. "The Audi. I had the title transferred this morning. It is in Vivian's name now." A pause. "I thought you should hear it from me." Rosa's hands went still on the dish rack. Just for a second, just long enough. Claire looked at her husband across the kitchen. The morning light was flat and gray. She could feel the baby pressing against her ribs the way she had all night, that specific insistent weight that no position fixed. "The car," Claire said. "Yes, you gave your mistress the car. I would prefer if you did not use that word." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her coffee cup, walked to the sink, poured it out, and set the cup down carefully. "Thank you for letting me know," she said. She went upstairs. She got dressed. She called a car. She had a prenatal appointment at New York Presbyterian at 9, a routine check on position. She had been looking forward to it, the way she had learned to look forward to these appointments over the past months. An hour where the only thing that mattered was the heartbeat on the monitor, steady and strong and entirely indifferent to everything happening in the world outside that room. The car dropped her at the main entrance on 68th Street. She thanked the driver. She stepped out onto the sidewalk. The patch of black ice was invisible under a thin coat of slush, and her right foot went out from under her before she had registered the problem. She felt the world tilt, felt her hands come up on instinct, felt the particular lurch of someone who understands in a fraction of a second that they are going to hit the ground. She did not hit the ground. A hand caught her arm, firm, quick, no hesitation. And then she was upright, heart hammering, one hand pressed flat against her stomach without thinking. The man who had caught her was tall, somewhere in his mid-40s, dark coat, the kind of face that did not announce itself. He was looking at her with an expression that was more focused than warm, more assessing than concerned. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes," she exhaled. "Yes, thank you. Go inside and sit down before you do anything else." She almost said she was fine. She was not fine. Her heart was still going too fast, and her hands were not entirely steady, and the baby had shifted in a way that felt like alarm, even if it probably was not. "Okay," she said. He walked with her to the entrance and held the door and stayed while a nurse came over. And within 5 minutes Claire was in a side room with her blood pressure being taken, and her doctor being called down early. The man stayed near the door, not hovering, just present, in the way of someone who has decided they are not leaving yet and does not feel the need to explain why. When the nurse stepped out, Claire looked at him. "You do not have to stay," she said. "I know. I mean it. I am going to be fine. Then it will not take long," he said. She studied him. "Why were you here? At the hospital, meeting nearby. And now you are in a side room with a stranger, apparently." There was something in the way he said it, dry, self-aware, not performing anything, that made her feel, unexpectedly, like almost smiling. She could not remember the last time something had made her feel like almost smiling. The doctor came in, checked everything. Confirmed the baby was fine, heart rate steady, no signs of distress. Blood pressure elevated, but not dangerously. She recommended 20 minutes of sitting before Claire went anywhere. When the doctor left, the man reached into his coat and held out a card. Cream-colored, plain. Just a name and a number. Marcus Webb. In case anything feels off later, he said, I know a maternal fetal specialist on the 14th floor if you need a second opinion. You know a specialist here. I know people. She looked up from the card. Who are you? Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile. Someone who was in the right place, he said. Take care of yourself. He left. She watched him through the glass partition as he crossed the main lobby. Halfway to the exit, he stopped. A man in a hospital administrator's badge intercepted him. Hand extended, the greeting of someone who had known him for years. They shook hands. The administrator clapped him on the shoulder. Claire could not hear what they said. She watched until they moved out of her sight line. She looked down at the card in her hand. She put it in her coat pocket. That afternoon, she called the divorce attorney, whose number she had been keeping in her phone for 3 weeks. The intake coordinator was efficient and kind and said someone would follow up within 24 hours. Claire thanked her and ended the call and sat for a moment in the quiet of the apartment and felt something she had not felt in a long time. Not hope exactly. Something more practical than hope. The feeling of a door that had been stuck finally moving on its hinge. Daniel came home late. She heard him go to his office, heard the low murmur of a phone call, through the wall. Then silence. Then the sound of him coming to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to him set his water glass on the nightstand. The glass made a small, unsteady sound against the wood. His hand was trembling slightly. She noticed that and filed it away the way she filed everything. Carefully, without comment. She thought about the name on the card in her coat pocket. She thought about the man who knew people. She thought about what she was going to do next. The apartment in the West 70s was on the 4th floor of a building that had not been renovated since the 90s and had a kitchen window that looked directly into the brick wall of the building next door. Claire signed the lease on a Thursday and moved in on Saturday with 2 suitcases, a box of books, and Adele. Adele Torres had been Claire's closest friend since their first year at Columbia. She was a corporate litigator now, sharp and constitutionally incapable of tact when she thought you were making a mistake, which meant she had spent most of Claire's marriage biting her tongue. When Claire called and told her what had happened, Adele said something unprintable about Daniel and then said, "Tell me what you need." What Claire needed was someone to carry boxes and make her eat and not require her to process her feelings on a schedule. Adele was good at all 3. They sat on the floor of the empty living room that first evening eating Thai food out of containers because Claire did not have plates yet. Adele looked around at the bare walls and said, without a trace of pity, "This place has potential." "It is fine," Claire said. "I mean it. New paint, a decent rug." Adele. "Right." Adele set her fork down. "How are you actually doing?" "I am tired and my back hurts, and I have a meeting with the attorney Monday, and I need to stop thinking about all of it for approximately 45 minutes so I can finish eating." Claire looked at her. "So right now I am fine." Adele studied her. Then she handed Claire the food. "Eat," she said. "We can panic later." Margaret Chen and her associate Priya met with Claire on Monday morning. They were thorough and unsentimental, and very clear about what the process would look like. Claire spread everything she had been able to access across the conference table and walked them through it the way she would have walked a client through a financial model, systematically, without editorializing. Margaret watched her with an expression Claire could not quite name. "You have done a lot of this work already," Margaret said. "I am a financial analyst," Claire said. "Or I was. I took time off when we moved to New York. Daniel's career was in a growth phase." She paused. "I have been doing contract work recently, through a firm called Harrow Analytics. It has been steady. Have you seen any unusual activity in the Vance Group accounts? Anything suggesting Daniel might be moving assets?" "Not yet," Claire said. "But I will be watching." She said it quietly, without drama. Margaret wrote something in her notes. The call from Daniel came 4 days later. An actual call, not a text, which was unusual enough that she almost did not answer. When she did, his voice had that particular smoothness he used in professional contexts, the one that had impressed her once. "I would like to meet," he said, "just to talk through the practical things." No attorneys. She almost said no. Then she thought about what Margaret had said about watching. "Fine," she said. "When?" His office was on 52nd Street, 12th floor, corner windows looking south over Midtown. The receptionist called up without asking her name. Daniel was on the phone when she arrived. He held up one finger. Just a minute. She sat and waited and looked out at the city and thought about the last time she had been in this building. The office warming 3 years ago, the glass of champagne, the uncomplicated pride she had felt standing beside him. When he hung up, he smiled his good smile, the warm, disarming one, and slid a folder across the desk. She opened it. 90 seconds to read it. 30 more to identify the 3 places where it was built to work against her. The support calculation used a baseline income figure that erased her contract work. The asset division carved out Daniel's Vance Group equity as premarital, ignoring the fact that the company's current value had been built almost entirely during their marriage, and the language around the baby had been drafted by someone who knew exactly what they were protecting and exactly what they were taking. She closed the folder. "I will need my attorney to review this," she said. "Of course." He leaned back. "The longer this goes on, the more expensive it gets for both of us, Claire. That is not a threat. It is just reality." "I understand reality," she said. She stood, picked up her bag, and turned toward the door. Through the glass partition of the reception area, a woman was sitting in one of the chairs along the far wall. Pale camel coat. Claire recognized the coat because she had been there when Daniel bought it 8 months ago, in a boutique in Soho. He had said it was a gift for a colleague. Vivian was younger than Claire had let herself imagine. Mid-30s, carefully put together, the kind of prettiness that required effort and carried it off well. She looked up when she felt Claire's gaze, and something passed between them. Not triumph, not guilt, but the strange charged nothing of 2 people acknowledging a situation that neither of them had language for. Claire held her gaze for 2 seconds. Then she walked to the elevator. He had brought her here on purpose, she thought, writing down. He wanted me to see her. He thought it would knock something loose. The elevator opened. She walked out into the cold. It did not work, she thought, and kept walking. That same evening, she opened her laptop and pulled up the Harrow Analytics portal. She had been doing contract financial modeling for them for 6 weeks. Project-based work, the kind that reminded her she was still good at this. She was deep in a cash flow model when her phone buzzed. Marcus Webb. She stared at it, then answered. "I wanted to check in," he said, without greeting. "You had a scare. I said I would. That was almost 2 weeks ago." "I know." A pause. "How are you feeling?" "Fine. Everything is fine. You did not have to call." "No," he agreed. A silence that was neither comfortable nor uncomfortable. "How did you get my number?" "Your intake form at the hospital listed it as a contact number." "That seems like information they should not be sharing." "Normally, no." He did not elaborate. "Thank you for calling," she said. Of course. She hung up and sat for a moment with the phone in her hand. He called again the following week, and the week after. The calls were 10 or 15 minutes, about almost nothing. Her new neighborhood, something he had read, the particular bleakness of New York in February. He never asked about Daniel. She never brought him up. It became, without either of them deciding it, a standing thing. A small, reliable constant in a period that had very few of those. A text arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. "You should talk to Diana Reyes at Mitchell and Park before your next meeting. She is the best in the city for situations like yours." No greeting, no context. Claire called him immediately. "Who is Diana Reyes?" "A family law attorney. She handles high-asset divorces with business component disputes. She has won every significant case she has taken in the last 4 years." "I already have attorneys." "I know. Then why?" Because your situation has specific components that require someone with a particular kind of experience, he said. How do you know what my situation involves? A pause. I know how these things tend to go, he said. That is not an answer. No, he said, it is not. The plain acknowledgement stopped her. Most people, when caught not answering, redirected or softened. He just said, "You are right. It is not an answer." She called Diana Reyes the next morning. In 20 minutes, Diana said 3 things no one else had thought to say yet. Claire added her to the team. Adele called on a Friday evening. "I need to show you something," Adele said. Facebook, of all places. A closed neighborhood group. She sent the screenshot. A post from Kevin, one of Daniel's golf friends, in a group of about 200 people. Couples from their old neighborhood, people who had been at their wedding. Tough times for our friend D. Going through a really painful separation after his wife struggled a lot emotionally during the pregnancy. For those who know him, he could use the support right now. 43 comments. Claire read every one. Most of them were some version of "so sorry" and sending love, from people who had sat at her dinner table, who had kissed her cheek at their wedding reception. She read them all the way through. Then she put the phone down on the kitchen table and sat with her hands flat on the surface and breathed. "Screenshot everything," Claire said. "Every comment. Save all of it. Already done." "What are you going to do with it?" "I do not know yet," Claire said, "but I am going to do something with it." She put the phone down, put one hand on her stomach, and felt her daughter shift, that slow rolling movement she had gotten used to. "I know," she said quietly, to the room, to the baby, to the version of herself that had been sitting very still for a very long time. "I know. February in New York has a quality that people who have never lived through it do not fully understand. It is not just cold. Cold is December, cold you can dress for. February is the cold that has been going on too long, that has settled into the bones of the city, that makes even the most committed New Yorkers count the weeks until something changes." Claire had always liked February anyway. There was something honest about it. No pretense, no decoration, just the city as it actually was. She was getting on with it. The routine she had built in the West 70s apartment was deliberate and simple. Up by 6, coffee, an hour of work before the day's demands started. Standing calls with Margaret or Priya twice a week. Prenatal appointments on alternating Wednesdays. Contract work through Harrow, which had expanded to nearly full-time hours at her request. Partly for the income, partly because she needed something that required her full attention for several hours each day. Something that reminded her she was capable of things that had nothing to do with Daniel Vance. Adele came twice a week with food and company. Marcus called on Thursdays. She had stopped pretending, even to herself, that the calls were nothing. They were 15 minutes of someone treating her like a full person at a time when most people in her life were managing her like a situation to be handled. He asked things and waited for actual answers. He disagreed with her sometimes, plainly, without softening it, which she found more respectful than the careful agreement she got from people who were afraid of upsetting her. She did not know what any of it was. She knew it was something. A Monday in the second week of February. The project came in flagged as priority. The summary described it as mergers and acquisitions due diligence for a mid-size commercial real estate holding company, assets across 4 states. Full cash flow analysis and a valuation stress test under 3 interest rate scenarios. Exactly the kind of work Claire was good at. She opened the file package and started. The first 2 days were pure mechanics, getting familiar with the asset structure, identifying anomalies, some aggressive depreciation schedules, a pair of intercompany loans that were not fully documented, a revenue recognition approach in one subsidiary that would need flagging. On the 3rd day, she opened the supplementary materials folder, legal entity structure, ownership chart, historical transactions. She was clicking through efficiently, making notes, when she opened a subfolder labeled Prior Transaction History and saw the document. Dated 26 months ago. Title, Vance Group Holdings. Independent Valuation Analysis. Prepared by C. Harrington, CFA. Morrison Financial Consulting. Morrison Financial. her employer before she had moved to New York with Daniel. The job she had left when they had decided together that flexibility was what the moment required. She had told herself it was temporary. Harrington, her maiden name. Her name before she became Claire Vance. She stared at the screen without moving. Then she opened it. She remembered writing it. 6 weeks of work, one of the more significant assignments she had had at Morrison. A private equity client considering a controlling stake in Vance Group, hiring Morrison for independent due diligence. Claire had been the lead analyst. She had spent weeks inside that company's financials, modeling projections, testing the assumptions in their growth plan against real market data. What she had found was that Vance Group was overvalued, not dramatically, but meaningfully. The growth assumptions built into Daniel's projections were optimistic in ways the underlying data did not support. The deal had been priced on a valuation that her analysis showed was about 18% above what the numbers justified. She had written it up. Her supervisor had reviewed it. The client had received the report and, based on it and other factors, had declined to proceed. She had never known who the client was. That was handled at the partner level. She had just done the analysis. And now her analysis was sitting in a supplementary materials folder for a project assigned to her through Harrow Analytics, attached as historical reference because the same acquiring party had apparently looked at the same target twice. She found the client reference code in the intake form and typed it into the Harrow system. The system returned a parent entity, Meridian Capital Partners. She sat very still. Meridian Capital Partners. Margaret had mentioned that name in one of their Monday calls. Something about institutional pressure on Vance Group's refinancing. A fund holding some position in the company's capital structure. Claire had written it in her notes without fully registering it. She registered it now. She closed the subfolder, went back to the cash flow model, worked for 2 more hours, and then packed up and went home. On the way, she stopped at the drugstore and bought a pack of printer paper. On a Tuesday in the 3rd week of February, she was coming back from a late afternoon session at Harrow when she saw him. Daniel. He was half a block ahead, not looking her way, walking with a woman she recognized even from behind. The particular posture, the camel coat. They were close in the way of people who have stopped managing how close they stand in public. His hand was at the small of Vivienne's back, easy and automatic, the gesture of someone who has been doing it long enough that it does not require thought. Claire stopped on the sidewalk. She stood there while the city moved around her, and she watched her husband walk down the street with the woman he had chosen instead of her. And she felt not the grief she had expected, not the anger she had earned. Something quieter. The specific sensation of a door closing on a room you have already left. She turned and walked the other way. Marcus called Thursday. "How has the week been?" he asked. "Busy." "Good busy. Mostly. The work." "Yes. There is a project I have been on that has turned out to be more interesting than I expected." "Good interesting or complicated interesting?" "Both, maybe." "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask." "That is not the same as saying you will answer." "No," he agreed. "It is not." "What do you do exactly, professionally?" "Investments," he said. "That is very broad." "It is a broad field, Marcus." A pause. "Private equity, primarily. Some real estate. A few other things." "How long have you had a daughter and not mentioned her?" A brief silence, surprised. "You never asked," he said. "That is fair. Tell me about her." He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was deciding whether to give something real. Then, "Her name is Nora. She is 9. She is playing a tree in her school play right now, and she has developed a complete backstory for the tree, including the tree's childhood, and a theory about why the tree grew in that particular spot and not somewhere else. She explained the whole thing to me over dinner last week. It took 40 minutes. Claire felt something in her chest move. She sounds wonderful. She is the best person I know," he said. "Just a fact, not performed." He suggested dinner the following week. Directly, simply, as if it were a logistical question, which somehow made it easier to say yes. They went to a restaurant in the West Village. Warm, not too loud, booths deep enough that a conversation could stay private. She was there first. He arrived a few minutes after the reservation time, still in his work coat, unhurried in the way of someone who knows they are not late. He sat down and looked at the menu and said, "The fish here is very good." "I have been avoiding fish for 8 months," she said. He looked up. "Right. Sorry." He said it with a brief expression of someone who had just remembered something important they should have thought of sooner. She found it unexpectedly endearing. The small human error in a man who otherwise seemed to calculate everything. They talked about small things for a while. Nora's tree backstory, which had apparently acquired additional chapters since their last conversation. The neighborhood Claire was starting to know. A film they had both seen and had almost entirely different memories of. Then, somewhere in the middle of the main course, Marcus set his fork down and looked at her and said, "Who were you before the marriage made you smaller?" She looked up. It was not cruel. It was not even accusatory. It was the same directness he brought to everything. Just wanting to know something, not trying to make a point. She opened her mouth to give the practiced answer. The resume version. The analyst, the Columbia degree, the Morrison career she had set aside temporarily. She looked at him and decided not to. "I was someone who was good at her work and knew it," she said. Not arrogantly. "I had just earned it, and I knew I had earned it, and I liked knowing it." She paused, and then, "I spent 6 years in a marriage where that was background noise." Something Daniel acknowledged, the way you acknowledge a feature of a house you are not using. Nice to have. Not relevant to anything that mattered to him. She had not said that out loud before. Not to Adele, not to the attorneys, not to anyone. It sat between them, in the warm light of the restaurant. "Did you know that when you were in it?" he asked. "I knew something was wrong. I thought it was something I could fix. I thought a lot of things were fixable." He nodded. He did not offer a reassurance. She was grateful for that. "What about you?" she said. "Who are you that you do not let people see?" He considered it seriously. "Someone who learned to operate at a distance because it felt safer," he said, "and who kept doing it long after it stopped being necessary." Why did it feel safer originally? "Because someone I trusted completely used that trust to do significant damage," he said. "My business partner. 8 years of working together. He used my identity and my capital to fund a personal fraud scheme. It took 14 months and a federal investigation to clear my name." He said it evenly, without self-pity. "After that, I decided not to give anyone that kind of access again." "And how is that working out?" The almost smile. "Ask me in a few months." His phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it, something shifting slightly in his face. "I need to take this," he said. "I am sorry." He stood and moved toward the back of the restaurant. She heard two things before he was out of range. The word yes, and then, clearly, the Vance matter. She set her wine glass down. He came back 4 minutes later and sat across from her and said, "I am sorry about that. Everything okay?" "Fine. Something that needed attention." He picked up his fork. "You were saying." "I was not saying anything yet." She looked at him across the table. "What is the Vance matter?" His expression did not change. He did not flinch, did not look away. He looked at her calmly. "It is a business matter," he said. "That involves the name Vance. It is a fairly common name." She held his gaze. He held hers. The restaurant moved around them. "Okay," she said after a long moment. She let it go. Or she appeared to let it go, which was not the same thing. That night, at 11:30, Claire was sitting on her kitchen floor. She had lowered herself down to get something from the bottom cabinet, and found that getting back up required more effort than was willing to make immediately. And so she had stayed. Laptop on the floor in front of her, the printer paper in a stack beside her. She had been at it for 2 hours. Eajgar open in one tab, Delaware Incorporation records in another, a hand-drawn chart on the top sheet of paper that was starting to look like something real. Meridian Capital Partners. She had found the Delaware filing, the SEC Investment Advisor registration, the fund disclosure documents. She had not found yet the name behind it, but the fund's regulatory filings listed a registered agent, and that agent's address linked to 3 other entities. And one of those entities had filed a Schedule 13D 2 years ago, and in that filing, On page 9 of 14, in the Control Persons section, there was a name, Webb Capital Management LLC, Principal Marcus A. Webb. She looked at the name on her screen. She picked up the pen and wrote the name at the top of the chart. Slowly, deliberately. Then she found something else. A supplementary cross-reference in one of the older Meridian filings led her to a document she had not expected to find, her own valuation analysis, the one she had written at Morrison 2 years ago, cited in Meridian's internal review notes as the primary basis for their decision not to proceed with the Vance Group acquisition. She read her own name on the page. Harrington, CFA, Morrison Financial Consulting. The analysis she had written at a desk in Chicago for a client whose identity she had never known. Working through 6 weeks of complicated data, because the data was there and the problem was interesting, and that was what she did. That analysis had been in Marcus Webb's files for 2 years. It had protected his capital from a bad investment. He had read her name. He had known what she was capable of. Before she fell on a patch of ice in a hospital parking lot, and he caught her and said he was just someone passing through. She sat on the kitchen floor with the chart in her lap and her hand on her stomach and tried to understand what she felt about that. She did not reach a conclusion. She went to bed instead and lay in the dark and thought about a woman named C. Harrington, who used to know exactly what she was worth and was beginning, slowly and with some difficulty, to remember. The weekend arrived gray and still, the city at half volume. Claire had nowhere to be until Monday. She made coffee, ate breakfast, and sat down at the kitchen table with her laptop and her chart and her stack of notes. She worked straight through Friday evening and most of Saturday. It was methodical and slow and occasionally tedious, the way real financial investigation always is. Cross-referencing entity names against state incorporation records, following registered agent addresses across filings, because sophisticated holding structures reveal themselves not in the documents they are required to file, but in the small administrative consistencies that link one entity to another. This was the work. It had always been the work. The willingness to sit with incomplete information and keep pulling on threads until something gave. By Saturday evening, she had the full structure mapped. Marcus Webb, through Webb Capital Management, held a controlling interest in Meridian Capital Partners. Meridian held a 44% stake in a private debt fund called Meridian Strategic Credit, which had provided significant mezzanine financing in Vance Group's 2021 capital restructuring. The debt position gave Meridian specific rights over Vance Group's financial operations. Not a controlling equity stake, but something more powerful in a liquidity-constrained environment. The ability to call defaults, accelerate repayment schedules, trigger review provisions that could make refinancing extremely difficult. Daniel had been operating his company for 3 years with Marcus Webb, holding a position in his capital structure that could, at Marcus's discretion, make Daniel's professional life very difficult indeed. Daniel almost certainly did not know who was behind Meridian. Claire looked at the chart, at the lines and boxes and her own careful handwriting, at her name on the valuation analysis from 2 years ago. Then her phone buzzed. 2:07 in the morning. She had lost track of time again. A text from Marcus. "I know what you are doing." Not a question, not a threat. A statement, delivered with the same plainness he brought to everything. She looked at it for a moment, then typed back. "Then you know I am not going to stop." She set the phone down and watched it. The 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again, then stopped. He did not respond. She turned the phone face down and went back to her chart. The hearing was scheduled for Wednesday. Margaret called Monday morning with the details. Daniel's attorneys had filed a motion to freeze Claire's access to the joint marital accounts, arguing that her contract work through Harrow Analytics constituted an undisclosed conflict that tainted her financial disclosures. It was a tactical move, Margaret said, not a strong legal argument, designed to create delay and pressure and the kind of procedural mess that wore people down and made them accept worse settlements just to make it stop. "They are not expecting to win this motion," Margaret said. They are expecting it to cost you. I want to present something myself, Claire said. Not instead of you. Alongside, I have something that changes the nature of the argument. I need to be the one to present it, because I need the other side to understand that I did this work myself. If it comes through an attorney, it is just a legal maneuver. If it comes from me, it means something different. What do you have? Claire told her. The silence on the other end had a different quality than the first one. Send me everything tonight, Margaret said. All of it. She called Marcus after she hung up with Margaret. He answered immediately. You knew I found it, she said. Yes. The Harrow System logs contractor, access to client materials. Yes. You have known since Thursday. Yes. And you did not say anything. She let that sit. Were you going to tell me? At some point. Were you planning to tell me who you were? The silence that followed was the most honest thing he had given her in 2 months. Not strategic. Just a man sitting with a question he did not have a clean answer to. I do not know, he said finally. She had expected yes. The admission of uncertainty landed differently. Everything I found, she said. Is it accurate? Is anything incomplete? What you found is accurate. I built it. I know what it looks like. And Meridian's current position in Vance Group's capital structure. Is there anything I should know before I walk into that room Wednesday? A pause. We have been evaluating whether to exercise the accelerated review provision on 2 covenant conditions in the mezzanine agreement. It has been under legal review for 6 weeks. Nothing has been triggered yet, but it could be. At your discretion, yes. She was quiet. I am not asking you to do anything with that. Whatever you decide about those provisions, that is your business decision. I am not using this divorce to influence your business position, and I need that to be equally true in the other direction. Understood. Good. I need you to not be in that courtroom Wednesday. Why? Because if you are there, it stops being about what I found in public filings and becomes about you and Daniel and the business dispute. I need Wednesday to be about the divorce, about bad faith. Your presence changes the geometry of that. A long pause. All right, he said. I will not be there. Thank you. She almost hung up. Then Marcus. The valuation analysis. The one I wrote at Morrison. Was it the primary factor in Meridian's decision not to acquire? A pause. Yes. You read my name 2 years before I fell in that parking lot. Yes. Okay, she said. Wednesday. We will talk after Wednesday. She hung up. The hearing was in a conference room on the 17th floor of a building on Lexington Avenue. Margaret and Diana were there, and a paralegal who had printed and bound everything. Claire had compiled in 4 copies with color-coded tabs. Daniel's lead attorney was a man named Carver, 50-something, the kind of lawyer who used physical density as a tactical instrument and was very good at it. Daniel sat beside him in a dark suit with the posture of someone who had been coached. Carver presented the motion with thoroughness and skill. The Harrow connection. The alleged conflict of interest. The argument that Claire's financial disclosures were compromised by her contractual relationship with a party whose interests were adverse to Vance Group. He made it sound entirely reasonable. When he finished, Margaret spoke briefly. Then she said, "My client would like to address the substance of the conflict of interest claim directly." Carver looked mildly surprised. This is not a trial. Direct client presentation is not standard. I am not testifying, Claire said. I am presenting a financial analysis. That is what I do professionally, and the subject matter is directly relevant to your motion. She looked at Judith Farrow, the mediator. May I? Judith Farrow looked at Carver. He had no procedural grounds to object, and she could see him calculating that. He made a small gesture. Be my guest. Claire opened the bound document and placed a copy in front of each person at the table. She spent the next 14 minutes walking through the structure, not performing, not arguing, just doing what she had always been able to do at her best, taking something complex and making it clear, building the picture from the bottom, up until the person looking at it could not avoid seeing what was there. The registered agent connections, the entity chain, from Web Capital through Meridian to the Meridian Strategic Credit Fund. The financing position in Vance Group's 2021 restructuring. the covenant terms giving Meridian specific rights over the company's refinancing activity, each filing labeled with its document number and public access date. She set the last page down and looked up. Carver was reading, which meant he had not known how much she had, or had not known she could present it like this, or both. Then she looked at Daniel. He had stopped reading. He was looking at her. Not with anger, with something more complicated than anger. She had seen that expression on his face only a few times in 6 years, each time in a moment when something he had believed was permanent had turned out not to be. The conflict of interest argument, Claire said, addressing Judith Farrow, rests on the assumption that my contract work through Harrow placed me in a position of improper access to information about Vance Group. What the capital structure actually shows is that Meridian's position in Vance Group's financing is documented in filings accessible to any member of the public, and that my analysis of those filings was conducted independently, using publicly available data without any information provided to me by the fund or its principals. She paused. The conflict of interest claim is not only legally insufficient, it is factually inverted. The only party in this room that has been operating with undisclosed information about the other party's business situation is Vance Group. The room was quiet. Carver set his copy down. He looked at Daniel. Daniel's jaw was tight. He was still looking at Claire. "Who helped you do this?" He said it before Carver could stop him. "I did it myself," Claire said. "The filings are publicly available. So is the corporate entity database." She held his gaze. "I am a financial analyst, Daniel. I have always been a financial analyst. You just did not find it particularly useful until now." Judith Farrow cleared her throat. "Carver, does your client wish to proceed with the motion as filed?" "We would like to request a brief recess," Carver said. 15 minutes, granted. The room emptied. Margaret caught Claire's eye and gave her a look that said very clearly she was going to have significant things to say later in private. Claire walked to the window. 17 floors up. Lexington Avenue ran south, steady with midday traffic. The ordinary machinery of the city going about its business. She felt Daniel come to stand near her. Not beside her. Close but not beside. The way people stand when they want to say something and have not decided if they are going to. "Who is he to you?" Daniel said quietly. "Webb. That is a personal matter that has nothing to do with this proceeding. He has been behind this from the beginning. He has been in the capital structure of your company for 3 years," she said. "That happened before I knew his name." She turned and looked at Daniel directly. "Everything I presented today I found in public records. No one gave it to me." A pause. "If you had read your own financing documents more carefully, you would have found it years ago." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face. The recognition of a specific kind of loss that you do not fully understand until you are already past the point of preventing it. "The motion is being withdrawn," Carver said from across the room. Claire nodded. She turned back to the window. What she did not see was Carver's junior attorney slipping out the door with a phone already at his ear. She found out 2 hours later when Margaret called. They filed a complaint with the Professional Certification Board. Margaret said carefully, "Against your financial analyst credentials, alleging you used proprietary client information obtained through your contract work to gain advantage in personal legal proceedings." Claire sat down on the edge of the bed. Outside, the afternoon was going gray. "It will not hold up," Margaret said. "Everything you used was public. They know that. But the investigation takes time, and while it is open, your certification status is technically under review. It is going to slow your income down. 3 to 6 months for a preliminary determination." "I understand," Claire said. "This is a bad faith filing," Margaret said. "It is designed to punish you for what you did in that room today, which was effective and correct, and which they cannot challenge on the merits." "I know exactly what they are doing," Claire said. She sat with the phone after she hung up. She thought about her mother. Patricia Harrington, who had stayed in a wrong marriage for 22 years because she had no professional footing that was hers. Every time she had looked at the exit required something she did not have. I have it, Claire thought. I rebuilt it when it was almost gone, and I am not surrendering any part of it without a fight. She lay down on top of the covers with her coat still on, her hand resting on her stomach. Outside, the city kept going. 3 weeks later, at 4 in the morning on a Tuesday, her daughter was born. The labor started the way her daughter would later approach most things, with complete confidence in her own timing and no particular interest in convenience. Claire called Adele at 4 in the morning. Adele arrived in 22 minutes with overnight bags that suggested she had had it packed for some time. They took a car to the hospital, and Adele held Claire's hand through the parts that required it, and talked about nothing important through the parts that required distraction. And at 9:47 in the morning, Ellie arrived. She was small and loud and entirely complete. The nurse placed her on Claire's chest, and the room went very quiet. Just the baby's breathing and the ordinary hospital sounds. Through the closed door, and Adele in the chair by the window, not saying anything, which was the right call. Claire held her daughter against her skin and felt something happen that she did not have a word for. Not peace, not happiness. Something older than both of those. The feeling of having walked a very long way and finally stopped. She had been afraid in the weeks leading up to this that she would feel the absence of Daniel in this room. She did not. What she felt, instead, was the completeness of what was present. Adele and the baby and herself, and how entirely sufficient it was. She looked at Ellie's face, scrunched, certain, already opinionated seeming. "Hi," she said, very quiet. Ellie opened her eyes for a fraction of a second, unfocused, vast, and then closed them again. She was perfect. She was here. They had both made it through. It was in that moment that something finished completing itself in Claire. All the things she had survived in the past 5 months assembled themselves into a shape she could finally see clearly. She had left. She had built something when she had almost nothing to build with. She had walked into a courtroom and presented her own work and made it count. And now she was here, in this room, with this person who was entirely new and entirely hers. She cried. Not from pain and not from grief, from the specific relief of having arrived. Daniel did not come. He had been notified through Margaret's office, the legally appropriate method, and he did not come. And Claire did not allow herself to feel anything particular about that. Not in this room. This room was not his. She named her daughter Ellie Harrington, not Vance. She had thought about it for one evening, alone, and decided without drama. Her daughter would carry her mother's name. The name Claire had worked under. The name on the analysis that had started everything. Adele stayed for the first 5 days, sleeping on the couch, handling night wakings in shifts so that Claire could sleep 4 consecutive hours. On the 6th day, she went back to work, but came back every evening that first week, and every other day the week after. Marcus sent flowers on the 4th day. White freesia, a full arrangement, simple and exactly right. No card, just her name on the delivery slip. She had mentioned freesia once, in the middle of an unremarkable Thursday call, talking about the flower market near her old apartment in Chicago, the one she used to stop at on Saturday mornings. She had said it in passing, not even as a preference, just a memory. He had remembered. She put them on the kitchen table where she could see them from the couch. She did not call him back. This was a choice she had made deliberately. 4 days of not answering. Not from anger, not because she had decided anything final about him, but because she needed to think without the pull of his voice, and she was honest enough with herself to know that his voice had a pull. What she needed to think about was the complaint against her professional credentials. She thought about her mother again in those first quiet days, with Ellie sleeping on her chest. She thought about Patricia Harrington staying in a wrong marriage because the exit required something she did not have. Every time she had looked at the door, the math did not work. The complaint was designed to be that math, to reach into the thing Claire had rebuilt and make the numbers stop working, to put her back in the position of someone who could not afford to leave. She was not going to let that happen. On the 9th day, she called Margaret. Ellie was asleep in the bassinet beside the couch. Winter light came through the kitchen window at a low angle that made the apartment look warmer than its was. "We are fighting it," Claire said. "The complaint. We go through the process. We file the counter. We document everything. I want the full record on paper. That this was filed 2 hours after a hearing, where I presented publicly available data that undermined their legal position." "It is slow," Margaret said, "and it costs money. I know. I have been clear-eyed about the timeline since February." She paused. "I also need the divorce settlement to account for the income disruption. That goes into the damages calculation." "We can make that argument," Margaret said. "Then let us make it." She hung up and sat for a moment. My mother did not have this, she thought. She did not have work she had built herself, credentials with her name on them. She did not have the thing that made the exit survivable. I have it. I nearly lost it, and I built it back. And I am not surrendering any part of it without a fight. Picked up her phone. Typed 3 words. "Come on, Saturday." Marcus responded in under a minute. "What time?" 10. Okay. The confrontation happened on Thursday before Saturday came. She was coming back from Ellie's first pediatric appointment. Everything fine. Weight good. The doctor pleased. She had stopped at the coffee place on 74th that had become part of her routine. She was standing outside, waiting for a car, Ellie in the carrier, against her chest, when she heard Daniel's voice from around the corner. The voice came from the small alcove, near the service entrance, the kind of accidental pocket of semi-privacy that the city creates between buildings. She stood still on the sidewalk and listened. There were 2 of them. Daniel talking and someone else listening. Daniel's tone was tight, controlled. The voice he used when he was angry and trying to manage it in public. She could not make out all the words, but she heard the shape of it. Something about orchestrated from the beginning. Something about using the process. And then, clearly, because he raised his voice on this part, she came to you because you have money. That is what this is. That is all this ever is with her. She has always needed someone to carry her. She found your capital structure in public filings. The other voice was quieter, but it carried further, with the particular quality of someone who does not need to raise his voice to be heard. She did it at 2 in the morning, alone. 8 months pregnant, on her kitchen floor. She did not need my money or your money or anyone else's to do that. A pause. She has never needed what you are describing. That is something you told yourself so. You did not have to think too hard about what you actually cost her. The silence after that was long enough that Claire realized she had stopped breathing. She heard a third voice then. Carver, somewhere behind the others, saying Daniel's name. Then, the sound of footsteps moving away. Then, just before they rounded the corner and were gone, Daniel's voice again, low. "She did not deserve it," he said. "I know that." Then Carver's voice, and then the footsteps fading, and then silence. She stood on the sidewalk and breathed. She thought about what Daniel had almost said at the end, the sentence he did not finish. She found, to her own surprise, that she did not feel triumph or satisfaction or even relief. She felt something quieter and more complete. The way you feel when you understand that something you had been waiting for is no longer necessary. You have moved past needing it. You have arrived somewhere on the other side of it. She adjusted Ellie in the carrier. Her daughter made a small protest sound and then settled. Marcus came around the corner. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at her with an expression that was careful in the way of someone trying to determine what she had heard and what she felt about it. "How much of that did you hear?" he said. "Enough." He nodded. "You said the right things," she said. "I said true things. It is not always the same." He looked at her for a moment, then at Ellie. His expression changed the way anyone's expression changes when they look at a very new person. Something in it that does not have a polished version. "Can I?" he started, and then stopped. "Yes," she said. She stepped slightly closer. He looked at Ellie, with the focused attention he brought to most things, and then something in his face got quieter. He put one careful finger against her daughter's hand, and Ellie, in the way of newborns, immediately gripped it without waking. He stood there for a moment, not saying anything. "She is something," he said finally. "Yes," Claire said. "She really is." She stepped back. He let go. They stood on the sidewalk in the cold for a moment, neither of them saying what the moment actually was. Saturday, she said. Saturday, he agreed. She turned and walked to her car. She did not look back, but she knew he was still standing there. He arrived at 10 past 10 on Saturday morning. She heard the knock and opened the door, and he was standing in the hallway in a gray sweater instead of his usual coat, which for some reason made him look more like a person and less like a position. He was holding a paper bag. Bagels, he said. I did not know if you had eaten. I had not. Come in. He came in and looked around with the careful attention of someone seeing a place for the first time. The bookshelves she had finally put up, the rug she had finally bought, the kitchen table with a chair pulled out because she had been sitting there when she heard the knock. Ellie was in the bouncer beside the couch, awake, examining the ceiling with her characteristic focused intensity. Marcus looked at her. He crossed the room and crouched down to the floor, unhurried, completely unself-conscious, and looked at Ellie at her own level. Hi, he said. Very quiet. Ellie stopped examining the ceiling. She looked at him. She made a sound that was not quite a word, and not quite nothing. Marcus glanced up at Claire. She has opinions. Constantly, Claire said. About everything. He stood up. She poured coffee. They sat down at the kitchen table, and for a few minutes they talked about small things. Nora's school play, which had apparently expanded from one tree to an ensemble of trees with interconnected storylines. Ellie's pediatric appointment. The way the apartment had started to feel like somewhere rather than somewhere temporary. Then Claire put her coffee cup down and looked at him. I need to ask you something, and I need you to actually answer it. All right. When you caught me in that parking lot, you already knew who I was. Yes. You had read the analysis. You knew I had worked at Morrison, that I had done the Vance Group valuation. Yes. And the meeting you had nearby that day. Was it real? A pause. I had a meeting at a building 4 blocks away. That part is true. He met her eyes. I had also seen, through my assistant, that the appointment calendar overlapped with your doctor's practice. I knew there was a chance I might see you. She sat with that for a moment. You came looking. I came to a hospital I have supported, for a meeting that was real, knowing there was a possibility. He said it steadily, not apologetically. I did not plan what happened in the parking lot, but I was not entirely a stranger passing through either. And after. The calls. The calls were the calls. Nothing calculated. Diana Reyes, I recommended her because she was the right attorney for your specific situation, and I knew your situation because I knew who your husband was. A pause. I should have told you who I was when I found out you were at Harrow. That was when I should have said something. But you did not. Why not? He was quiet long enough that she knew he was actually working out the answer rather than reaching for the easiest version. Because by the time I knew you were at Harrow, he said, I had had 6 weeks of Thursday calls. And I did not want to change what those were. He looked at her. Which is not a justification. I know that. No, she said. It is not. It is what I do, he said. I hold things back because disclosing them feels like a risk. I have been doing it so long that I sometimes do not distinguish between caution and withholding anymore. I am aware that is a problem. Are you aware it is a problem specifically because of what it cost me, she said. Not in the abstract. Because I was operating inside your world without knowing it, and that information gap put my professional credentials at risk. Yes, he said. I know that. And he looked at her steadily. I am sorry, he said. Not the kind of sorry that is a prelude to an explanation. The kind where the thing was wrong, and I know it was wrong, and I do not have a version of the story where it was not. She sat with that. The analysis, she said. My analysis. It was the primary reason Meridian walked away from the Vance Group acquisition. Yes. So my work Daniel never valued. Work I did before I knew any of you existed. Protected your capital from a bad investment. Yes. And then 2 years later, you were outside that hospital. I had been thinking about C. Harrington from Morrison Financial for 2 years, he said. Not in a way I acted on. The way you think about a piece of work that was unusually good. You remember who did it. And then I was walking to my car, and a woman nearly went down on a patch of ice, and I knew in about 3 seconds who she was. He paused. I do not have a clean category for that. I do not know what to do with it exactly. No, she said. Neither do I. Ellie made the escalating sound that meant the window from content to urgent was closing fast. Claire stood and picked her up, settled her against her shoulder, and she quieted almost immediately. Marcus watched. There was something in his face that could not be practiced. I need to tell you something, she said, not as a negotiation, just as information. All right. I spent 6 years making myself smaller because I thought it was what keeping the marriage required. Staying flexible, not pushing too hard on things that mattered to me, telling myself I was choosing it when a lot of it I was not. She shifted Ellie slightly. I am not doing that again, not with anyone. I am not available for a version of anything where I operate with less information than the person I am dealing with. I understand, he said. I am not finished, he waited. What you did, the withholding, I understand the origin of it. The partner, the investigation, the way you learned to operate at a remove. I am not saying you are a bad person. I am saying it is a pattern that caused real damage in my life. And I cannot have that pattern be part of whatever this is. She met his eyes. If whatever this is requires me to trust you, then you have to actually be trustworthy. In the ways that are hard, not just the ways that are easy. Yes, he said. I know. That is all. What else is there to say that is worth anything? He said it simply. The only thing that actually means something is whether I change the pattern going forward. And you have no evidence of that yet. So the only honest thing I can say is that you are right, and that I want to earn the different answer, and that I understand if that is not enough right now. She looked at him. Then she said, if you are about to do the thing where you hold something back, I need you to notice it and say so. You do not have to have it solved. Just say, I am doing the thing. I will know what you mean. He thought about that. That is harder than the other things you have asked for, he said. Yes, she said, it is. That is why I am asking for it, specifically. He was quiet for a moment. Then he started to say something, stopped, looked at her, and said, I am doing the thing right now. What is it? She said. He looked down at his coffee cup, then back at her. I have been afraid for the past 4 days that you were going to open that door on Saturday and decide I was not worth the complication. He said it without performance, just a fact. Set down plainly. She held his gaze, and now he almost smiled. Now I am still afraid, but I am saying so. She nodded slowly. That counts, she said. He exhaled. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. Ellie had gone heavy against her shoulder, the boneless weight of a baby falling toward sleep. Claire put a hand on her daughter's back and felt her breathe. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, a siren moved through somewhere below. Distant, present, then gone. The way things are in a city that keeps going regardless. Marcus was watching her, not with the careful assessment he had had when they first sat down. Something different, quieter. He reached across the table, not for her hand, not for anything dramatic. He picked up the coffee cup she had pushed to one side and set it back where it would be easier for her to reach, one-handed with the baby on her shoulder. A small thing. An entirely ordinary thing. The kind of thing you do without thinking when you have started paying attention to someone. Claire looked at the cup, then she looked at him. He was not looking at her the way a man looks at a woman he is trying to impress. He was looking at her the way you look at someone you have started to understand. Something patient in it, something that was not going anywhere. More coffee, she said. Yes, he said. She got up to pour it. Ellie sighed and resettled against her shoulder, still asleep. Marcus stood up too, to be in the room differently than he had been sitting down, the way you shift when something has changed, and the previous position no longer quite fits. She handed him the cup. Their hands were close for a second. Outside, a door opened somewhere in the building, and cold air moved through and was gone. The Saturday light shifted. The city kept going in its enormous, indifferent way, full of people who did not know or care about any of this. And in the kitchen on the 4th floor, 2 people stood with their coffee and their ordinary morning, and the small person asleep on her mother's shoulder, and began.